Flay is already one of the strongest builds in the game, and Blizzard thought, let's make it stronger. Over the last week, I have tested, upgraded, and cried masterworked. I'm going to share with you everything that I've learned. Before we jump into the build, a couple of things that you need to know. The Grandfather does not work with this variant. You lose way too much DPS. The Melted Heart of Selig, although it's tanky, does hurt in the higher levels of the pit. There are so many ways to build these builds this season, and please use whatever weapons and armor that you want. This is what I found works best for me. I have some gameplay of a tier 120 with no holy bolts and no iron skin. As always, we're going to start with a skill tree. Starting at the top, we're going to put 5 points into Flay. Then we're going to take Enhanced Flay, which gives us a 15% chance to cast Vulnerable on enemies for 3 seconds. Then we're going to go into Battle Flay. When Flay deals direct damage to an enemy, they take 10% increased bleed damage from you for the next 13 seconds. That's a multiplicative number, so that gives us a 10% boost to all of the bleed damage, which this build is built around bleed. So this is incredibly important. Skipping core skills, we're going to come down to Imposing Presence. We're going to max this out, put 3 points here, and then we're going to put 3 points into Martial Vigor for some damage reduction. We're going to take Rallying Cry all the way down through Enhanced Rallying Cry and Strategic Rallying Cry. This is where we're going to get Unstoppable from, and our Fortify. This is going to be really important because we're not going to be running Iron Skin with this version. 1 point into Challenging Shout, 1 point into Enhanced Challenging Shout. I'm not taking Outburst or Tough as Nails in this variant. It is an option for you. Because we're going to be running Rage of Paragoth and we're going to be running Bleed, we're getting both of these in that. If you feel a little bit squishy from damage reduction monsters that are distant from you, you can take these two because that'll automatically give you that damage reduction from distant enemies. So that is an option that if you wanted to swap to these 2 points, you can. 1 point into Warcry. We're going to be taking Power Warcry for this. Because we're going to be getting all of our Fortify from Rallying Cry, we don't need to take Mighty Warcry. So we're going to get that extra little damage boost to our Warcry when we're fighting trash. It's actually going to be very important because Flay is not the best trash clearing. So all of the damage we can get is going to be very beneficial. I'm going to be taking 3 points into Booming Voice. This is going to extend the duration of all of our shouts, which is actually going to be very, very important because we're taking Raid Leader. With Raid Leader up, our shouts heal for 3% of maximum life. Now, 3% doesn't sound like a lot, but when we're running 60, 70, 80, 90,000 life, it is actually a pretty significant number, and we rotate through our shouts. Because we have Booming Voice up, the shouts last for longer, so we're constantly being healed. If we have enough DR, we're always going to have Challenging Shout up, which is an extra 48% damage reduction for this. We're going to be incredibly tanky, and we're going to be healing constantly, and we don't have to rely on that oh crap moment button to hit Iron Skin. It's always going to be there. I feel very, very safe running it this way. A lot of people like Iron Skin, and if you do like Iron Skin, you can swap Iron Skin out for Rallying Cry. Guttural Yell. This gives us some extra damage reduction, 12% while our shouts are up. Our shouts are always up. So between running Guttural Yell and running Challenging Shout, that is 60% damage reduction. That is almost always active. We're going to be taking 3 points into Aggressive Resistance, additional 12% damage reduction while berserking, 3 points into Pit Fighter. This will give us a little bit more damage close and some distant damage reduction. 3 points into Slaying Strikes. When you're fighting an enemy in the pit and you're in the high end of the pit, when you start getting down towards that last 35% of life, which is injured enemies, we're going to gain that extra 23%. This is going to help that end of the fight feel like it doesn't drag on forever as your timer is getting closer and closer to ending. We're going to take 1 point into Rupture. Rupture is going to be our main source of damage dealer. Our bleeds are going to hit for a lot, but Rupture is going to hit for a lot more. We're going to go all the way through Enhanced Rupture and into Warrior Rupture. This is going to give us our additional 40% attack speed. This additional attack speed helps us stack bleed a lot faster, so this way when we do Rupture, we're going to be hitting for harder. Let's look at why Rupture is going to be the biggest source of damage for us. Ripping your weapon out of enemies during Rupture causes the explosion that deals bleeding damage over 5 seconds. This bleeding is increased by 10% for every 50 strength you have. If you look at the current bonus, it's going to be increased by 390%, and that is a multiplicative number. So when we use Rupture, we get all of our bonuses from all of our damage on top of that 390%. This is why Rupture is hitting for billions and billions and barbillions of damage. 1 point to Hamstring. This will put slow on healthy enemies. Then Cut to the Bone. Your bleeding effects deal 40% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. This is going to help stack the damage that our bleed is doing by a lot. As many points as you can get in Cut to the Bone, it's going to make a very big difference in terms of your damage. 1 point into Steel Grasp, 1 point into Enhanced Steel Grasp, This will just be an extra source of vulnerable damage that we're going to be getting on top of Flay already. Fighter's Steel Grasp is going to give us Berserking for 2 seconds every time we do that. This is going to be important because this is going to be one of the main sources of our Berserking, especially when we're on a boss. During Trash, we're always going to have Warcry up, so we'll be gaining Berserking from Warcry, but when we're doing a boss fight, this will be a very big source of Berserking damage. 1 point into Thick Skin, so that we can unlock Counteroffensive. While you have Fortify over 50% of your maximum life, you deal 12% increased damage. Put 1 point into Defensive Stance for a little bit of extra DR while we're fortified. We're going 3 points into Heavy-Handed. This is going to increase our critical strike damage, which is going to be very important because we're going to be running Gushing Wounds. This is going to be a huge part of our damage source. We have to be able to stack enough critical strike chance and critical strike damage to make sure that this is up all the time and we're taking advantage of the bonus. Unfortunately, this is why damage to close doesn't really work for this build, because we have to have as much critical strike damage as we can to take full advantage of Gushing Wounds. So what Gushing Wounds does, and we'll stop right here to take a little look at it. When causing an enemy to bleed, you have a chance equal to your critical strike chance to increase the bleed amount by 140% of your critical strike damage bonus. What does that mean? Looking at our character sheet, I have a 69% chance to crit, and I have 2,100 critical strike damage. I have a 69% chance to increase my bleeding damage by 2,900%. So you take all that bleed damage, you multiply it by 2,900%, and that's how we are putting so much bleed onto targets. That is why Gushing Wounds is incredibly important, and why you're going to need to be able to level a rogue, take that rogue, and find the tempering manual for critical strike damage bonus. Put all of the gear that you want from your Barbarian into your stash, swap to your rogue, use that rogue to temper the critical strike damage, put it back in your stash, hop back onto your barb. It is a process, and unfortunately right now, with the way the game is, that is the only way that we have to do it. Let's take a look at the Paragon board now. In your starter board, we're going to be running Exploit. Why this is important, and we'll get to this later on in the Paragon board, but that vulnerable damage that is going to give us is going to take that vulnerable additive number and turn it into a multiplicative number. So we want to be stacking vulnerable damage in this as well as critical strike damage. Moving up into the Warbringer board, we're going to be running Executioner. This is going to play a big part in the damage dealing, and this is the reason that we're going to be using a polearm. We'll cover more about the polearms later when we get to the gear section, but this is going to give us 10% multiplicative increased damage and some additional damage to polearms here. Coming over into the Blood Rage node, this is going to be 30% multiplicative, and killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to grant Berserking for 5 seconds. While we're running through the pits, as we're killing bleeding enemies, because everything is going to be bleeding, we're going to have Berserking up almost all the time, because we're going to have this, we're going to have Steel Grasp, and we're going to have Warcry up constantly. So this is going to be a really big source of damage as well. In order to hit that 30% bonus, you only need to make sure that your damage while Berserking is just around 300%. I'm a little over here, but I'm only over by just a small amount, which is okay. If you're over by a little bit or a lot, it's still additive damage, so it's not hurting you. But as close as you can get to that, you can put points into other things. Going back to the Paragon board. From this board, we're going to be heading down. It is very important that you go in the order that the boards are listed on the planner, because as you go further out into your boards, your rare nodes start to cost more and more, and we won't be unlocking all of them. There should be making some changes when the patch updates, but for now, make sure that you're taking the ones in the order that we're going in. This is going to be your Decimator board. We're going to always be overpowering with Rupture, so we should be seeing a 20% multiplicative damage increase because our enemies are always going to be vulnerable, and we're always going to be overpowering. We're going to be running Ire in this board. This is going to give us damage while Berserking and get us to that 300%. It also is going to give us an additional 10% damage reduction from enemies. Coming up, we're going to go into the Hemorrhage board. This is super important. This is a very, very key to this. I don't have enough vulnerable damage. This number can actually go much higher. This is where it takes all of our additive vulnerable damage and changes it into a multiplicative number. You take 15% of whatever your vulnerable damage bonus is. That is right here in your stats line. So we take 15% of that bonus right there, and then that gets converted into a multiplicative number. Now that can go much higher. You're actually aiming for a 2-to-1 ratio. If you have 2,100 critical strike chance, you want to have about 1,000 vulnerable damage. I'm still working on my gear, so I still have a long way to go, but that's really what you want to be aiming for. Let's hop back into the Paragon board. Inside of the Hemorrhage board, we're going to be taking Martial. This is going to help with the cooldown reduction on our shouts, and it's also going to give us some additional damage reduction from all of our magic nodes here. Heading down, we're going to be going into the Carnage board. While berserking, critical strikes increase your attack speed by 2% up to 16%. This is great because we want to be attacking as fast as possible, so we stack as many stacks of bleed within that Flay duration. And we'll talk about Flay duration when we get to our weapons. Inside this board, we're going to be running Wrath. Now remember, we want to be stacking critical strike damage, so this is going to be a really, really big benefit to that. We don't need the second half of this glyph. We don't need to be generating any Fury. We're going to be always generating Fury because Flay is a basic skill. Finally, for the last board, coming up to the very top here, this is going to be your Bonebreaker board. Inside this board, we're going to be running Territorial for the extra 10% damage reduction from close enemies and a little bit of extra additive damage from your enemies to close. Let's take a look at the aspects, affixes, and all of our gear. I tested this out the other night, and I want to cover this before we hop into any of the details. I put a Grandfather on, I masterworked it all the way up. We went and we tested it versus the polearm. I did about 850 million bleed ticks with the polearm. When I put the Grandfather on, I only barely got to 300 million. The difference in rupture damage was 25 billion all the way down to 8 billion. So you can put the Grandfather on if you really want to run it, but the way that this build is set up, it is not designed to run a Grandfather. Your Flay duration is going to be incredibly important, and we're going to cover that when we get to the weapons, but it is not a viable use for this build. Starting with the helmet, we are going to be running Harlequin's Crest. In the planner, I'm going to have what I would like to have on the Masterworking crits. I did not want a double on life or on resource generation. If you could, life and cooldown reduction are going to be the best. Some people love to run a lot of cooldown reduction, so if you have a triple on that, which I have only gotten 2 triples in the entire time I've been playing, but if you can get a triple on cooldown reduction, that's going to be ideal. For the chest piece, we're going to be running Rage of Haragoth. The important stat on this is going to be the damage reduction from bleeding enemies. The rest of them don't really matter too much. And then you're going to be your aspects. The closer you can get to 40%, the more cooldown you're going to have when you're attacking, and you get pull a big pack, you pop Rupture, it hits everything, your cooldown reductions like that are done. So this is going to be very important to get your masterworking rolls on the damage reduction from bleeding, which I have not gotten yet, so I'm going to have to re-roll this chest piece. And again, we're still working on a gear. I'm far from there yet, but this has been a journey, and building builds takes a long time. For the gloves, we're going to be running elements on the gloves, attack speed, critical strike chance, vulnerable damage. For this one, we're running crowd control duration and then critical strike damage. I covered how to put the critical strike damage onto your weapons and onto your armor in the skill portion of the video, so if you need to, go back to the beginning, take a look at that. Moving down to our pants, we're going to be running Undying on this. If you feel squishy when you're running through the pits and you need a little bit more damage reduction, you can always swap here to Might. This is going to be a great option because this will give you an additional 20% damage reduction all the time. All you have to do is attack the air, and this will give you that damage reduction. For the affixes, we're going to be running Flay, Strength, Maximum Life. There is an option here to swap this around. If you want to run your resistance all here, we have the option of running all resist here, and then you can swap boots around a little bit. Well, we'll get that when we get to the boots. You can either run Life if you're feeling squishy, Strength if you're feeling that you're tanky enough and you want to do more damage, then you can put all resistance on to help with that resistance cap, because hitting resistance cap on a barbarian is definitely a little tricky, especially if you're trying to save some tempers and not put any resistances on your temper. For the tempers here, we're going to be running crowd control duration and imposing presence. If you can get more into Flay than imposing presence, that's fine. That will give you a little bit more damage. If you can get more into imposing presence than Flay, that gives you more life. It is completely up to you, but what imposing presence does, it's going to be in your skill tree. It's going to give you 6% life for each rank. If you look, I have 72% life just from having the ranks in imposing presence. That's the only reason that I have as much life as I have. If I ran with something else, my life would go down. But if you did that, you would need to run a lot of DR. So make sure that you're where you want to be with this. Coming down to the boots, this is where I had the resistance, all, and the armor. Now this is where I meant that you can swap these out. If you wanted to put them onto your pants, you can swap one of the two to your pants, and this way, for your boots, we can also run Ranks of Warcry. So the more Ranks of Warcry we have, the more damage it does, and the more cooldown it has. So right now, my Warcry has a 16.8 second cooldown. I don't have my cooldown reduction on my Shakeout, and I also don't have anything on my boots. So that can go even lower. The lower it is, the more damage you do, the more you bleed, the more you flay, the more you rupture. My boots are bricked. I don't actually want the barrier generation because I'm not going to be running Iron Skin. If I could, I would be running your crowd control duration. The difference that we did in this and what I've learned is that I took off your steel grasp stuns. The reason that we took it off, when you're pushing the pits and you're pushing to high tiers, you have to constantly drag monsters with you using steel grasp. If you have a stun on, they get stuck in place. Not only do they get stuck in place, but they get to unstoppable sooner. So this way I can't drag them as fast as I want to or as much as I need to. We have replaced all of our stuns, we have no concussion, and we have no steel grasp stuns. This was one of the big things that I learned as I pushed higher into the pit, as I talked to other people while I was streaming, we brainstormed. So this is actually a really big change that made the quality of life in pushing much, much better. So anywhere you take off any sort of stun or any sort of crowd control, you're going to be able to drag a lot farther using your steel grasp. And of course, we're running movement speed. Movement speed is life. I had the greater affix on resistance to all elements here, and I got a double on it. That allowed me to get to almost max. What I do want to do, and I had to swap some gear out, so my resistances aren't exactly where I want them to be. I want to get shadow resistance up to max, and then I can leave poison at minimum 50%. If you leave poison at 50% and then you run an elixir of anti-venom, you can run this elixir alongside any other elixir in the game. This will take your poison resistance all the way up to max. So the poison resistance is actually the one that you can do the least. When I'm farming, I don't notice any of these reductions at all. But when I'm doing higher level pits and I get to something that has shadow resistance, if it's that low, it hurts a lot. So playing around with your resistances is going to be very important to make sure that you're capped out. When you get up to here, if I need to, and I'm going to be running into really big issues, I can take maximum life and I can reroll that, or I can take strength and I can reroll that to make sure that I do cap out on my resistances. For the aspect here, we're going to be running hectic. Every 5 attacks, your active cooldowns are reduced by 2 seconds. We're going to be casting with basic skill all the time, so we're always going to be reducing our cooldowns additionally on top of running Rage of Heragoth, which is reducing our cooldowns by up to 40% when we're inflicting bleed on an enemy. Every time we flay, we inflict bleed. Every time we rupture, we inflict bleed. So between Rage of Heragoth reducing our cooldowns and Hectic reducing our cooldowns, they come up very, very quickly. It's a lot of fun to play. Moving down to the weapon, we're going to be running Moonrise. This is going to give us 20% attack speed after we hit 5 times. It's going to put us into a vampiric blood rage. We gain 160% basic skill damage and 15% movement speed. For the affixes, we're going to be running strength, max life, critical strike damage. We're going to be doing critical strike damage on 2, and we're going to be doing vulnerable damage on the other 2. Looking at your tempers, this is probably one of the most important tempers for this whole build. We want to be running Flay duration. What this does is that it increases the amount of time that Flay bleeds stay on an enemy. If we look at Flay, right now, my Flay duration is 21.68 seconds. So as soon as I hit my first Flay, I have 21.68 seconds for that bleed to stay on the enemy. Within that 21.68, every single time that I hit, I'm stacking more and more Flay bleed. If that is cut down, that is a significant reduction in the amount of bleed that I can put on and less damage that Rupture hits for. So just to show you how important this is, if I take off this one weapon and then we go back into our skill tree and we look at Flay, I've lost almost 25% of the duration. A 25% reduction in damage just from one weapon. This is why the Grandfather doesn't work for this build. It is very important to keep your Flay duration as long as you possibly can for this variant. We're going to be running swords because we want the inherent critical strike damage that is on the swords for your one-handed weapons. We're going to be running strength, max life, and vulnerable damage here. I have to re-roll this because I did not get really what I wanted. I got 1 on Flay duration. I wanted minimum 2. If you can get 3, that's great. There is a lot of talk that I've seen with people saying that you want either 2 plus vulnerable and plus critical strike damage, or you want 3 on all of them. It is really, really hard to get even 3. I spent 3 or 4 days trying to just get this 2. So it took a long time for me to actually get what I wanted. I was using a 0 greater affix weapon up until that point. So you don't actually need to be running greater affix weapons. Do your masterworking. I got it all the way up to 12. It carried me all the way through 120 of the pit. Make sure you get your masterworking done. Don't wait for the perfect gear. For the first weapon, we're going to be running Edge Master. Again, Flay duration, critical strike damage. If you need to look at the critical strike damage and how to get it, hop back into the skill portion of this video. For our next weapon, strength, max life, critical strike damage. I have damage while berserking on this weapon, and then I have Flay duration. We want to make sure that we're getting our damage while berserking, so that's at least 300%. I'll cover how to get there once we get to our jewelry. For the aspect, we're going to be running Inner Calm. This gives us a 10% multiplicative number all the time. And then when we stand still for at least 3 seconds, we gain 30% multiplicative because we gain 3 times the bonus. For our slashing weapon, we're going to be running a polearm. And we talked about this in the Paragon board. We're going to be running Executioner Glyph. This gives us a 10% multiplicative number. The reason that we're going to be running a polearm, when you look at your expertise and you look at polearm, you deal 15% multiplicative increased damage while healthy. With the amount that we heal, and with Challenging Shout and Guttural Yell always being up, we're going to be healthy a majority of the time. That means our HP is above 80%. We heal very quickly with Undying and with Wraith Leader. If it does dip below 80%, it goes right back up. This is going to give us that 25% multiplicative number between Executioner and using a polearm. We're going to be running Strength, Max Life, Vulnerable Damage. If you have Critical Strike damage here, and then you wanted to run Vulnerable Damage here, you can do that too. If you have Vulnerable Damage here and you want to run Critical Strike damage here, you can. Just make sure that you're alternating. You want a 2-to-1 ratio as best you can. We're going to be running Flay Duration. Again, I got a double here. This took me 4 days of farming and re-rolling. So remember, it is not a fast process. Take your time, enjoy the grind. It will happen, I promise. We're running Critical Strike damage as our last one. And then for our aspect, we're going to be running Wanton Rupture. Your Rupture does not remove the bleed damage from enemies. This occurs once every 13 seconds because we're using it on a 2-handed weapon. When we get into the gameplay loop after the aspects and the gear, I'll show you exactly what this means. But this is going to be a pretty important part of doing damage with Rupture and keeping that bleed on and stacking your bleed damage. Looking at our rings, attack speed, critical strike chance, critical strike damage. Because I don't have any damage while berserking on either of my 2-handed weapons, I have damage while berserking on here, and then I wanted to run Warcry cooldown. This is why I'm looking at a 16-second cooldown on Warcry, because I'm running it here and I'm running it on the other ring. For the aspects, we're going to be running Rapid. This is going to give us a boost to our attack speed with Flay. This will allow us to attack more often and stack more bleed from Flay within that 21 seconds of a duration. For the next ring, we're running Strength, Attack Speed, Critical Strike Chance. If I could roll Vulnerable Damage on this ring, I would, because I needed the Critical Strike Chance, because that is incredibly important. It's more important than a little bit of Vulnerable Damage would have been. So I've rolled for Critical Strike Chance and I left the Strength on there. When I find a new ring, I'll hopefully get Attack Speed, Vulnerable Damage, Critical Strike Chance. Running the same exact tempers here, Warcry cooldown, and damage while berserking. This put me just over my cap to get my damage while berserking to 300. For the aspect, we're running Berserk Ripping. Whenever you deal direct damage while berserking, inflict 30% of the base damage dealt as additional bleed over 5 seconds. This is just going to help us stack just a little bit of extra bleed so we're getting as much out of our bleed as we possibly can. This has to be used while you're berserking, and if you remember, while we're doing trash, we will have Warcry up almost 100% of the time. When we're doing bosses, Steel Grasp will be giving us berserking alongside of Warcry. This will give us that extra bleed when those two are up. If you find yourself not getting the cooldown reduction on your shouts that you want during boss fights, you do have an option here. This is something that I go back and forth on all the time, but if you wanted to run Bold Chieftain, you can use this, because now if I use my Warcry, a lot of the bosses have ads. So I could be running a 10-second cooldown on Warcry, and Warcry is going to be up for 7.4 seconds. With the extra cooldown that I get from Hectic, I may have 100% uptime on Warcry if I ran Bold Chieftain. So this is also an option for you to run too. This is something that I've gone back and forth on using. I'm probably going to have Bold Chieftain in the planner, but Berserk Ripping is going to be an option for you. If you feel like your cooldowns are enough and you're doing enough damage to the boss, you can run this for a little bit of extra damage. For the amulet, we're going to be running Attack Speed, Critical Strike Chance, and Cut to the Bone. This is a hard one to get. I got pretty lucky here. Ranks of Cut to the Bone is something that increase your bleed damage to vulnerable enemies, and it's a multiplicative number. So if you can get more points into this, that means your bleeds are going to be bigger. That means that it's going to do more damage when you rupture. This is going to be very important. So this is something that I'll probably end up re-rolling as well too. For the tempers, and as you can see, I only have damage on here. That was because I had one roll left after I got Imposing Presence, and I did not want to break this. So I rolled damage, and then I left it right there. This is something you want to roll critical strike damage instead of that damage. Mine bricked. I just left it as it is. It's still working. I'm still gaining damage. I'm just not getting as much because I'm not getting the additive number from the critical strike damage and I'm not getting the multiplier from Gushing Wounds. For the aspect, we're going to be running adaptability. The only part of this that we're going to be looking at is when you cast a basic skill above 50% of your maximum resource, which will always be above maximum resource because we're only using a generator, is we're going to deal 120% increased damage with our basic skill. The more damage Flay does, the more bleed it does. But it's going to be very important that we're running this. And this is why putting a Melted Heart of Selag on here is going to be a big hit to our damage. we're not going to have cut to the bone, we're not going to have critical strike chance, we're not going to have attack speed, and we're not going to have your adaptability. You can put adaptability on the ring if you're feeling super squishy and you feel like running Melted Heart of Selig and you replace Berserk Ripping, but I really don't suggest it because we're going to be tanky enough as it is, as long as you get your masterworking to level 12. That's the gear, aspects, and tempers. Let's talk about our gems. Whatever you don't have for resistances, we're going to be running in our jewelry. You're going to be running vulnerable damage and not basic damage in your weapons, because we want that vulnerable damage because that turns into a multiplicative number. If you're running basic skill damage on this from a topaz, it's only additive number. So we're getting the additive damage from the vulnerable damage, plus it's double dipping into the hemorrhage node and giving us a multiplicative number. So running your vulnerable damage with your sapphires here is much more important than running your basic skill damage. In the armor, we're running rubies. Depending on how you feel, when I speed farm, I actually swap these out for royal amethyst just for the extra strength, but for now and in the planner it's going to have rubies because this is going to be way more important when you're pushing, because you do need that extra life for undying and for raid leader. For the expertise, we're actually going to be running two-handed axe expertise. This gives us a 10% multiplicative increase to vulnerable enemies. Between Flay, the exploit glyph, and seal grasp, we're going to have everybody vulnerable, so we're going to have that extra 10% increased damage up all the time. For the skills, we're going to be running pole arms is going to be set to your Flay and also to your rupture. The way that attacks work and the way that skills work is all based on your weapon damage. So if we're running a really high weapon damage, we're going to hit those big top end damage bursts. It'll be a little bit slower because we're running a pole arm, but we're getting all of that extra multiplicative increased damage from using the pole arm. So that's why we're going to be using it on rupture, and we're also going to be using it on Flay. All right, we're going to head over to the training grounds. We're going to go over the gameplay loop and how to work this build. All right, we're here. Let's go over how to Flay. For elixirs, if you're going to be running anything, you can be running your anti-venom, and if you don't want to run holy bolts, especially after this nerf to them, you can run your elixir of advantage. This is going to give you increased attack speed and lucky hit chance. This will help proc our Rage of Harakoth. It'll also allow us to stack additional bleeds. So it's going to be actually really, really great elixir post running holy bolts if holy bolts is nerfed by quite a bit. If you like running holy bolts, it is definitely an option for you to run too. For this, we're just going to use this so you can see exactly what it looks like. These are the stats here if you wanted to pause it and take a look and see what they look like. This is the attack speed bonus with the elixir on. And then all of the stats here that we're running. We want to make sure that when we start this up, we start up using Rupture. Wanton Rupture, which is going to be running on our polearm. Every 13 seconds, we're going to be able to use this without removing bleeds. We're going to start with Rupture because it's going to give us that additional 40% in attack speed. We want to try and stack as many bleeds as we can before we use Wanton Rupture again. So we're going to start off by getting that 40% attack speed. Once we get 5 stacks, which is 5 hits, which will happen very quickly, we're going to gain an additional 20% attack speed here. And by the time we get those 5 hits in, adaptability will be kicking in for that extra 120% increased damage. We're also going to start with Warcry, so we get the additional 21% increased damage, and we're also going to get the berserking damage. After we use this, we're going to be using Flay, and then we're going to alternate between Steel Grasp and Warcry. We want to try and keep enemies vulnerable as much as we can and keep our berserking up as much as we can. If we let it fall off at all, then we're going to be losing out on a little bit of damage. I'm going to start running the rotation so you can see what it looks like. We want to take advantage from intercom, so we're going to be standing still for at least 3 seconds before we attack. This is what the buff looks like. This is going to be our elements buff. The sun is physical damage. The moon is not physical damage. We won't be getting any benefit from the moon. If you watch the attack power, which do not judge your character based on attack power, I'm just referencing attack power so you can know when your physical damage is up. When the moon clicks over, if this is when you can get your Wanton Ruptures to proc, you're going to do the most damage because you're going to have every single multiplicative number that you can active at the time. We're going to wait until the moon ticks over, and then we're going to pop Warcry, and then we're going to start playing. We're going to pop here, and then we just attack. And then as your berserking wears off, you're just going to keep that berserking up. You can watch Warcry's cooling down pretty quick, so we're going to use Warcry. Now Wanton Rupture's back up, so we're going to use it again. And it does 9 billion damage. So our goal is to keep on stacking those bleeds. If you can see, we're up to 400 million bleeds, and that will keep going up as we keep on attacking. You just keep on using these and alternating. If you can use a Warcry with elements and Rupture, that's when you're going to see some big numbers, okay? This is just going to be your basic rotation for this build here. When you're fighting bosses, this gets hard because you're going to be running around, you're going to be dodging things, you have to move, you have to other enemies that you're going to be attacking because you're going to grab them with steel grasp. So it is very important that you're working on making sure that you're just hitting the boss, and that when your Wanton Rupture is up, that you're using that only on the boss and only then. That's just your basic Flay. That number can go up the more you attack, and the longer that the boss fights are dragging on, you're going to be doing more damage as long as you can keep on stacking that bleed. A couple things that I want to go over. Wanton Rupture is indicated by the gold bar around your Rupture icon. When you're attacking and you're using Flay and you use Rupture, as soon as this comes back off of cooldown, it's going to show that it's ready again, and then it goes away. That means that it actually wasn't ready, and it is very tricky because sometimes, and I've done this a lot, I've used Rupture way too early because I wasn't paying attention to when I used Rupture. It looked like Wanton Rupture was ready, and then I removed all of the bleed off the boss fight. And then I had to restart regaining my bleed. So you need to make sure that you're paying attention to this build when you're doing it. As soon as it comes off of cooldown, it will not be actually ready, but it's going to indicate that it is. That is pretty much the rotation in a nutshell. This is something that takes some practice. When I first hopped into this, it was not easy. I went into the pits, I only masterworked to level 8, and then I died pretty quickly, and it did not feel good. I didn't think that I was going to continue with the build, but I decided to just stick with it. I masterworked a little bit more, I learned how to play Flay, and then it got really fun. It's challenging, it's not as easy as Bash to get into, but once you get the rotation down, you feel it out, you learn how to chain monsters, it starts to become a lot more fun. What I want to talk about, though, is the importance of masterworking. A lot of people have asked me, well, I'm at level 4, does it really make that big of a difference to get to level 8 or level 12? Yes, 100%. It makes a huge difference to get from level 4 to level 8 to level 12. Even just going from 4 up to 8, you're getting 15% to all of your stats. Every single one of them on your gear is getting increased by 15%. And then you're stacking 25% into, hopefully, a very, very important affix. That means that you're going to be gaining probably a good 25% increase in power just from 4 to 8. And then you go from 8 to 12, and it's the exact same thing. If you're only sitting at 4, you're missing a good 50-60% power, depending on where your masterworking lands. So if you run in with this build at level 4, and you go and try and clear high pits, it's not going to work. You have to make sure that you put importance on masterworking. You don't have to wait for the perfect gear. I didn't. Most of my gear only had single greater affixes, and some of them had 0. I still took them to level 12, and once I did, the build felt great. And then I was able to start pushing higher and higher, which that allowed me to farm more and more materials at a faster rate. I'm now up to about 1 minute and 30 seconds to clear pit 101. I can run it incredibly fast now because I got my masterworking up to where I wanted to. I learned how to play the build. So make sure you do it. It is so important. Don't wait. Please don't wait. That's the build. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. I love to hear from everybody. I try and get back to everybody that comments. This build has a ton of variation. So what I'm showing you is what worked for me. I'm more than open to hear what works for you because I love hearing from people and I love interacting with everybody. I'm live on YouTube and Twitch pretty much every night. Stop by, drop in, tell me what you did differently that's working really well for you. Let's get this Flay build rocking as best we can. Barb Nation. Thank you for watching. I'll see you soon.